Hi, today's July 30, 2023, and I'm honored to have Josh Guetzkow. Josh, tell us about yourself and what you've been up to.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Josh Guetzkow. I'm a senior lecturer in Department of Sociology and the Institute of Criminology at the Hebrew University, and I've spent the better part of 2+ years researching a wide variety of topics related to COVID and the COVID vaccines, including issues related to athlete deaths and
Right.
other health problems that might be related to the COVID vaccine.
Right. So that's been in the news lately. I certainly pray for his health, but LeBron James' son recently had cardiac arrest, and this has been on the heels of other athletes having issues. Damar Hamlin had apparently commodio cordis, and had sudden death, as it were, on the field, and was resuscitated and so forth. Um, it seems subjectively as if the numbers have gone up of young athletes, having suddenitis,
Right.
and no one wants to really talk about it. When it is discussed, and my little fingers have done the Google searching and Twitter and so forth. It's always brought up that there's this response that FIFA did a study of death registry, whatever, prior. So I'm going to pop that up for a second. And inevitably, I mean, it seems like a bot kind of thing. This same paper is brought up over and over and over again by everybody. You can see there's just a whole slew of the BMJ article. And if you keep going down the scroll, it's like everybody, these are all different people, independent, quote unquote, independent mind. It just seems like a bot army to bring up this article. Have you read this, Marge? Sparky Parkinson, MPC. I mean, I assume this is a high bot
Well,
content.
look, I think what is the point of this? The point of this is to say that, well, actually sudden deaths in athletes is not a new phenomenon, right?
Mhm.
And that's true. I mean, and this study isn't the only study that shows that. So we do need to be very careful. I mean, my own personal, sort of my take on this is that it's sort of obvious that there's been an increase in, if not sudden death, then sudden collapses, cardiac problems, respiratory problems among athletes since the rollout of the COVID vaccines. And I think what the problem is that a lot of people who object to that, the moment that you want to start discussing sort of the particularities of the data and the problems with drawing inferences from the data that we have, you begin to sound like you're trying to gaslight people, right? I think, the evidence of our eyes and ears is obvious. Historically, we've never seen a period where you have not just athletes, but coaches and referees and people in the stands, dropping like flies, sort of, and not necessarily dying, just dropping, right? So, for me, sort of to argue against that is almost like gaslighting. However, I am a scientist, and I'm trained in, methodology and statistics, and once you begin to look at the past research that's been done on this prior to the COVID era, the first thing that becomes clear is that, well, actually, yeah, athletes do die, and young athletes, teenage children do die, of cardiac or other problems suddenly, the young athletes, right? And we tend to think, well, wait, they're athletes, they must be super healthy. How could they just be suddenly dropping dead? But you're a physician, and I mean, people can overtrain, right? The one of the key causes of heart problems in athletes is HCM. Help me out with the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
Right. Yeah. We actually use a different, sometimes, yes, but this subaortic stenosis. There's cardiomyopathies. I mean, you can be otherwise healthy and then have this, cardiomegaly growing because there's an obstruction
Right.
at the right at
Or
the root of the aorta, so the heart's
it's just thickening, right? And then at
right.
some point it gets too
Right.
thick, right? And so if you're overtraining it, that can happen. So it does happen. So then we really need to ask, as sort of hard-nosed empiricists, has this been increasing, right? Has the rate of sudden death among athletes been increasing? And this issue burst onto the spotlight in late 2021, when it seemed like there was this series. Well, I think the very first time that it popped into people's consciousness was when the football player Christian Eriksen had a heart attack, went into cardiac arrest on the field, and was miraculously revived, and then had to have like a kind of a defibrillator implanted in him. And then in late 2021, there was just more and more instances of this happening very, very publicly in the middle of different broadcasts. And actually, I was sort of involved in this, and this was kind of an embarrassing moment for me. Actually, I'm gonna give you a little bit of the background of the story. I don't remember exactly when it was. I think it was maybe November, probably November 2021. And I was approached by a journalist friend of mine, a wonderful, wonderful journalist, Yafa Shiraz. She's Israeli. She actually broke a very interesting story in Israel where they used an experimental hepatitis B vaccine for babies that had been developed by an Israeli company that hadn't gone through stage 3 trials. They introduced it into Israel for babies, newborn babies, and for about 5 years, they gave like half the country's babies this new vaccine without telling the parents that hadn't been through any kind of stage 3 trials. Sort of seemed like they were doing a stage 3 trial in secret, and it caused all kinds of health problems. I won't get into it, but she's an amazing journalist. So she had started looking into this athlete problem, and she had compiled this huge list of athletes. Now, I didn't know anything about this at all at that time. I hadn't done a lick of background reading or anything like that. She said, "Do you think that can you say anything about this statistically?" Because she knows that I kind of, know a little bit about statistics. And I said, let me think about it. And I took a weekend, and I basically, the main problem that you have is like, you have to determine a denominator, right? That's one of the big problems.
That's the point I made.
Right. Yeah. Wait, we'll get back to that. But so I said, well, let's keep it small, and let's just look at soccer players, because I found this list on Wikipedia of Football Association soccer player deaths, the historical list. And I sort of like made this very faulty assumption at the time that the list was fairly comprehensive because of the sort of what do they call it, organized autism, or the kind of like Wikipedia people can be very, very it's Wikipedia, which isn't that reliable, but on the one hand, they can be very kind of like thorough in many ways. So I sort of assumed that this was a more or less thorough list, and which it wasn't. And I threw together this analysis over the course of a weekend, and she wanted to publish it on her blog, which was this very obscure Hebrew language Israeli blog. And I thought, okay, well, I'll do this. I'll talk about the limitations. And but then her post completely surprised me because it went viral. Somebody had posted a link to it, even though it was in Hebrew. And this was the first time I had been fact checked. And I got an email a couple weeks later from a Danish fact checking organization, basically saying this doesn't make sense. And you know what? I got to admit it. It was not a robust analysis. I made a lot of false assumptions, and I learned a lot from that. One of the things I learned is that you have to be much, much, much more careful when you do these things. I mean, I really thought this thing would be, again, nobody would see it and that sort of thing. And that certainly wasn't the case. So then I started really getting into it and reading more about it and learning more. And one of the big pieces of research, at least on soccer players, is the FIFA sudden death registry. And you and I were talking about that before. And so, that paper shows you were just showing me a bunch of screenshots of people linking to that, right?
Yes.
So that shows, a number, what is like 615 something, or
Yeah, it's right here. It's right here. Exactly.
617.
No, you're absolutely wrong. It was 617. I can't believe you were so factually wrong.
617 over 5 years.
Yeah, I actually kind of find this sort of amusing. It says 617 players with sudden death, and then it says over here 23% survived. So I kind of
Right.
find this slightly amusing. It's in the BMG with, I mean, I would put sick after the sudden death syndrome, i.e., not everybody's sudden death dies. I think, but they're saying, it would be probably sudden death if you weren't revived. I think it would be the better.
That's exactly right. And that makes sense to do that way, because we're getting better and better at reviving people. And so if you only look at the people who actually died, then you introduce a bias, a temporal bias, because,
Right.
less and less people should be dying over time, in theory, if we're getting better at saving them. So yeah, right. So sudden death there is either they died or would have died if not for a defibrillator or CPR.
Right.
And by the way, I was in touch with the authors of that paper. So, in late 2021, I started an effort, joined an effort that was started by Steve Kirsch to try to quantify this. It turns out it's really, really difficult. There's a lot of empirical, what would be the empirical problems with trying to really quantify this in a very serious way.
Right.
But I was in extensive contact with the authors of that paper, or the main author of that paper and his current PhD student, who basically runs the FIFA sudden death registry. So I know a lot about the methodology that they use.
So just a quick question: what is their denominator? I mean, what's the pool from which they're searching to get this 600 quote unquote death?
So
I mean, it's not the same number as the number of people in FIFA. I assume is this the universe of people who play what you call football, what we call soccer?
Yes, and it's interesting because they kind of underplay that. They use a tool, so they a little bit underplay this in the article, but they get their information from FIFA and from soccer organizations and federations. But neither FIFA nor any of those other federations has a requirement for teams to report these things. So it's in that sense, it's a little bit like VAERS, that there's a voluntary reporting aspect to it. So they supplement that. They get some of their reports that way, but most of their reports come through scanning media articles using a tool called Meltwater. It's a company that basically aggregates news from all over the world and allows you to search through it. And that's where most of their reports come from. So in that sense, it's everybody pretty much anywhere in the world that plays soccer. And FIFA has done, in a couple of years, they've tried to estimate the total number of soccer players worldwide. How thorough is their media search? It's hard to say. I think where they probably do their best, so they have different categories of players in that paper, and one of the categories is elite players. And the elite players, I think both, you're more likely to see a report on them in the newspaper, and second, you have a better way to calculate the denominator, because the way they define elite player is that they're either like an international team or a team that is in the top two league tiers of the country, right? So, every country, we don't really do this in the US, but in European countries, they have like multiple leagues. They have like the Premier League in England, right? But there's another league under that. And so you would be counted as an elite player if you played for one of those. So those, the team sizes for those things can be kind of counted and and quantified, and you can get a kind of denominator that way. But I'm going to tell you something. I spent a long time going through many reports of soccer players and other athletes, especially soccer players, though, falling down on the pitch and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually, and also how many died. And there was not an increase of soccer players dying in 2021. I didn't continue to count in 2022. But what there was an increase in the number of players that collapsed, okay, or the number of players who stopped in the middle of play, clutching their chests, complaining either of chest pain or pulmonary problems, or having difficulty breathing. They can't catch their breath, and then they have to be taken off the pitch. Oftentimes they'll go to the hospital, and in many cases they say, well, we don't, a couple of days later, there's a press release from the team saying so-and-so is back to playing, and we don't know what we don't know what it was that happened to them. So, so if you take, if you count both cardiac deaths or sudden deaths and all of these instances of either players collapsing or, having these cardiac / pulmonary problems, you can see a very clear trend both over the course of 2021 and 2021 compared to can you show the slide there? So what this shows you is the sudden. Okay, so this is just showing cardiac or unexplained death in 2019 versus 2021. And so if you look at the total number, you don't necessarily see a significant difference. But if you look at the number over time, what you see is that there, in the second part or the second quarter or third of 2021 compared to 2019, you see kind of this increase over time. But I wanted to show you also the other one. Do I need to share my screen?
Yeah, you need to change it.
Okay, I think I'm okay. So there you can see it counts. So you have the blue category. This is the cardiac or breathing difficulties or collapsing on the pitch. It doesn't necessarily mean you're dead. And by the way, in all these video clips where you see these athletes falling over, many times we think, okay, well, that must mean they died. But most of the time they didn't die. Just they collapsed for one reason or another. Sometimes it's a cardiac problem.
Yeah, just as a side note, for a long period of time, I mean, New York's gotten more dangerous recently, but for a long period of time, the mortality numbers from crime were going down precipitously in New York City, and everyone's like, oh my God, it's getting so much safer. And apparently the data, I mean, it was getting somewhat safer, but the vast drop in deaths from crime was because the EMTs were getting there faster, and they had better modalities within the ambulances to keep people alive. They had a lot of plasma congeners and whatnot to kind of keep fluid up and so forth. So they were getting to the hospital alive, and the hospital did a better job keeping them alive, but people were still getting shot. Anyway, just side note. So sudden death is not necessarily a great measure because we have, AED, kind of devices so forth right on the field. So, right. I think the dropping part, dropping dead or dropping almost dead, and this kind of, blur of what is sudden death and sudden itis.
Right. Well, here I'm using the same kind of idea that the FIFA sudden death registry, where it's either they died or they were resuscitated. Mm-hmm. That would count as a death, sudden death. But what you can see here is that through the course of 2021, there's this huge increase in the last few months of 2021 among footballers. And one of the possibilities for this is that well, there weren't a lot of games in early 2021 because, the season was canceled. But actually, we looked at that, and the season wasn't exactly canceled. In many cases, they just had games with empty stadiums. But there really wasn't a huge decrease in early 2021 in the number of games played. There's a little bit of a decrease, but not huge. But you just see this, this huge increase in late 2021, and you sort of wonder, well, what could it be, right? What could spark this? And I think the players getting vaccinated. So the soccer season in Europe starts in August. I mean, they play throughout the summer in all kinds of different games. But the soccer season starts now. Here's an interesting anecdote about let me about Christian Eriksen that I brought up earlier. So he had a heart attack in May, I think, of 2021. It was May or June. And there was a lot of speculation about whether he had been vaccinated or not.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this Danish fact-checking website that came after me, they had an interesting article about it because they basically showed that the reports showing that he had been vaccinated were taken out of context. And I followed those links, and I sort of, I don't really trust fact-checkers. But in this case, they were correct. However, there was other information that was coming out where the coach was saying that the team wasn't vaccinated, and basically this fact-checking website said, well, that statement is also not clear, and even if the team, and also there was a statement that the team would be vaccinated for the beginning of the season. The later, that would be August 2021, which is when you see this rise. So even if the team had put off getting vaccinated before then, it would have, everybody, starting the season would have been vaccinated, basically. And the other thing that came out from this fact check was this understanding that even if the team itself hadn't been vaccinated, it doesn't mean that Eriksen himself wasn't vaccinated, right? Because it's not like the team was stopping people from vaccinating. It just means the team he was playing for didn't have at that time a vaccination requirement. And Eriksen has declined to state whether he was vaccinated or not. So it's sort of a question mark there. Mm-hmm. But I just bring that. The reason I brought that up is to say that part of this story is this idea that, well, the team didn't require vaccinations at that point, but they would be requiring them once the season started again in August. So, and then you see this big increase in the number of football players experiencing these problems in the second part of 2021. So it's very interesting timing. Now, going along this idea that maybe it's not deaths that have been increasing, but it's just a broader range of injuries and problems and collapses that are often unexplained. I have two things I want to say about that. One, and this is something Steve Kirsch pointed out, is that usually if it's a real cardiac problem or a real pulmonary problem, they can diagnose it. They know what it is, right? These things very rarely go undiagnosed. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly you have this rash of these occurrences of players dropping on the, collapsing or having these problems. They go to the hospital, they come back. Now, we don't know what happened. Well, that's already a kind of indication that it may be.
Yeah, it's changing from that FIFA BMJ registry where they were categorizing the types of illnesses.
Right. I contacted those. I don't remember exactly when it was. I think in late 2022 or early 2023, I contacted them to see if they had an update. And the answer I got was that no, they don't have an update. It turns out it takes them a long time to go through these reports, and they try to get medical records. I mean, they're very, very thorough. They're excellent research.
Right. So I just to kind of re-emphasize this point, math. At an early age, we learned fractions. Numerator, denominator. It was a total sidelight. There was an interesting clip I saw the other day from I think Christian Kirk, and he was had a hostile questioner because they were talking about the crime rate in the Black American population versus white, and the pleasant young questioner, actually she's pretty aggressive. She said, "You're all wrong because there's more crimes by whites in the United States." And he says, "Well, give me the numbers." She says, "Well, I don't know." She's forget the numbers. It was like 6 million crimes by white and 4 million crimes by blacks. And he said, "You do realize that there are whatever the number is, 4-5 times more whites than blacks in the United States." I can't remember exactly what it is. And so what you're saying is that they're almost equivalent number of crimes, but you're missing the denominator. And
Sure.
so just having a bland number like 6 million crimes by one group is not really indicative of the picture unless you factor in the rate. And so, I think I just want to point this out for all the people who keep reposting that BMJ thing. You need a denominator, and the FIFA numbers. There are a lot of elite soccer players and leagues and so forth. But in FIFA, I think comprises 240,000 members. This includes local soccer coaches and people who've had a pro career and whatnot. And unless you compare apples to apples, and you yield the denominator for the prior registry, then that prior registry is a canard. It's a meaningless factoid. And
Right.
I think you're trying to bring up I think it would be a way of kind of going back in time and reparsing it if we could suss out the numbers of elite players, you said, or FIFA like within that original registry. But I can't imagine they are as high as there are now. Is there any fact on that?
Well, so one of the things that I did was, so that FIFA registry goes from 2014 to, that paper covers 2014 to 2018. And I felt at some point in the course of my research that I had a very thorough list of football players at all levels who had died in 2019, 2020, 2021, or at least definitely 2021. And then I went and I said, okay, of these, who would be considered an elite player? And then I counted them up. And I compared them to the annual rate average. That's the best you can do with that paper, is to average it out over the time. And there wasn't a statistically significant increase among the elite players, at least. And this is why I started to focus more on. And again, that doesn't mean that's one subset of players. I was sufficiently satisfied that was true, and that was really the phenomenon that was really peaking. Was again these other issues that didn't necessarily involve death or near death. And one of the best research pieces that I saw on this used a database of soccer players, professional soccer players, called transfermarket.com. And this piece, this website no longer exists, but you can find it in archive.com. And I have this now up on my
okay, let me put it up.
PowerPoint. I want to share it. But basically what they did is they scraped the data from this website and showed how, and so this is like, it's stats on all different soccer players that play sort of in a professional market, and looks at, and it has data on their injuries and the nature of their injuries. And one of them is heart conditions. And what you can see is that over this period, this was called the COVIDworld.com website. Again, it no longer exists. You can see is in 2021, there was this big increase, which was more than a doubling of heart condition problems over the average of the previous 6 years. And this difference is statistically significant. So, so there does seem to be a real increase in this problem, which isn't, it's not 1,000% increase, or it's closer to like a doubling. But for me, this was one of the best pieces of data because the information is relatively comprehensive, and because this is transfer market, so it's kind of like about the market for soccer players.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's an interesting
It's
thing. A lot
not-
of times these secondary data sites have better data than the newsy kind of sites. I mean,
yeah,
here, I think it was called InTrade or something like that, where you people bet on the presidential elections and so forth, and their tracking numbers were better than the polls. So people get polled, but there are a lot of questions that people put into their polls, and then you have bias and so forth. But when people actually put their money where their mouths were, the betting polls are actually have
right.
geez, a better.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
this is kind of the same thing. This trading
yeah,
market where people are actually kind of
absolutely.
figuring out
Yeah,
how much players are worth and whatnot.
yeah. I've heard that. I've heard that. You can pull this off if you
Hmm.
want. Pull this down, but so that's kind of where I feel very I'm very empathic towards um, the son, the son of the famous basketball player
Yeah,
that
Bronny James.
Bronny James. But it's interesting because if you were actually based on past research, because there was a big research paper published in 2009 following decades of data collection on different sudden death problems, sudden cardiac deaths, sudden deaths among young athletes. And the highest rate, seemingly, I mean, they could have done a little bit better job just establishing their denominators, but it seemed like the highest likelihood was African American basketball players seem to be at the highest risk of some kind of cardiac problem.
Hmm.
So if you were going to expect it anywhere as a natural phenomenon, not related to the vaccine, you would exactly expect it in a player like Bronny. Again, I'm not saying that it wasn't the vaccine. Um, it might
Yeah.
very, very well be related to the vaccine, but we can't just say, well, this never happened in the past, and so it has to be the vaccine now because
Right.
frankly,
Obviously,
it could happen.
we always have this issue of dealing, with individuals and statistics. So, my
Right.
my job as a physician was to deal with the patient, and people would say, well, what do you, what can you say about, the rate of heart attacks in the country? It's like I can't. I mean, I'm talking about whether this one person had a particular problem, and everyone's his own laboratory, in a sense. He's having run his own history, his own diet, his own weight, his own this and that. And so your job as a physician is to treat that person. We're not here to treat statistics.
Yeah.
But my only point is, insofar as we look at the big picture, that a lot of this has been miscategorized. I mean, I as a general primer about vaccines, first of all, the name vaccine actually refers to cows, vaca, in Latin. Um, and it can refer to using cowpox as a treatment for smallpox. So it's vaccinia variola was given instead of smallpox. And so when they were injecting vaccinia, they became vaccination. Now that's an interesting side note, but they were doing it prior to the illness. This was always the concept was to inoculate prior to an illness. So you don't want to just give somebody, cowpox. If he's already had smallpox and he survived it, he's immune to it. So there's no point in giving a cowpox injection. This was before, so this was done in like the 18th century, and so this is a very old concept of inoculation. But this concept where we're giving a treatment way after the fact, and after somebody has already had the general underlying illness for which you're being quote unquote vaccinated, this is pointless. And so what we're seeing with these boosters is we're giving ancestral, and now added to the bivalent Omicron, we're giving a formulation of antigens to which the patient's already been exposed. So this can bring about ADE, antibody dependent enhancement. I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but I'm pointing out that what we've done here is add insult to injury potentially, and whatever the risk there was from COVID itself vis-a-vis heart. And a lot of people bring this up as well, that COVID can have a heart problem. Well, fine, but that's water under the bridge. You've already had that, been exposed to it. Why give re-exposure? And just as a side note, this is in the news, and I don't want to do too much of a diversion here, but this is our new. Oops, wrong one. Sorry about that. This is our new CDC director. I'll get to the picture in a second. She is hoping that COVID will become similar to flu shots, where it's going to be your annual COVID shot. Our CDC director, and here's the picture, which I find somewhat interesting in and of itself. First of all, the juxtaposition. I mean, you're living in Israel, and I assume you know what this is over here. This is a chai, and this presumes Jewish faith and so forth. And there's there's this kind of a forbidden back from the commandments false idols, and so there's kind of an idolatry thing going on. Anyway, that's my own personal, so it's kind of, I'm not the sociologist in the room here, but I think this is an interesting thing that going on, and we're supposed to trust somebody who has this kind of conflation of beliefs systems going on, and what is exactly what is exactly she's following, her heart, her mind, and so forth, and so annual COVID boosters, when this is never been a problem for youth, A, and B, it's a problem that already has disappeared, and if insofar as coronavirus still exists, just as it has always existed, coronavirus predates humans, and it's always been, as far as we've been able to track these viruses in the last century or so, has been the second most common named cause of the common cold. So there's conflation of the fact that coronavirus is omnipresent in the human experience with the fact that we had this, COVID thing going on, and now we're going to be injecting and re-injecting and so forth people with boosters or vaccination prevention for an illness for which they've already been exposed. Anyway, so that's my little diatribe just for the populace. I apologize, but let's get back. I actually want to segue, if we can, to some of your other work, because I really liked your Substack, and I want to show that for people. Let me see if I can find it in time here. So your Substack is here. We'll get to the title in a second, but. So here people can find you at Jackanapes Junction, but without getting too far into the name here, I want to talk about your paper from February about excess mortality in not just athletes, but I mean obviously the younger age groups are having this excess mortality, and this is way after the threat of coronavirus has gone away. During the age of COVID, there's not excess mortality in Germany, and now that it's gone as an illness, we're having this. And I don't know if you can speak to that briefly as we kind of round out our time together.
Sure. Well, this is not my study. This is a study by these two German researchers, Christian Kurbander, and I forget the other gentleman's name, Christoph Kubanel, a really brilliant German researcher who's done a lot of great work on these issues. And this is one of the most careful analyses I've seen yet of excess deaths, done very, very carefully, looking at different ranges. It's actually turns out it's not so straightforward. How do you calculate what an excess death is? What you're looking at is the very first preprint, but this has subsequently been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that's, I don't know what else to say about it. They basically show that not only do they show that there's increased excess deaths, but they also show, there's another graph there where they kind of look at its timing in relation to the COVID vaccine rollout, showing that it looks fairly, the timing, especially, for the younger groups, it seems very close to the timing of the vaccine rollout. And they also show the same thing for stillbirths. They show an increase in the stillbirth rate that's seems to be coincidental with the vaccination rollout. So, I think the paper sort of speaks for itself. It's very alarming. It's very alarming. But on the other hand, one thing I want to say, I mean, there's a lot of other analyses that you'll see out there about excess deaths in young people, which are troubling, but like the ONS in the UK, there's this huge delay in when they, like the date at which a death is entered into their database can be months or even as much as a year and a half after the death actually occurred. And so people are doing these analyses on increased excess deaths, but going well into 2023, but those deaths, especially among young people, because there's a longer delay after a young person dies and when their death is actually kind of officially registered. And so those deaths could have happened actually a long time ago. They didn't necessarily happen in 2023. So I don't know, there's an enormous amount of information out there, and it's very, very difficult to sift through it all.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to close out soon. But
Okay.
I'm in your debt. I think you were very thorough and useful, and that's a good combination. I think you come at it with perspicacity and humility, and you're not willing to say things that shouldn't be said. So I think people need to respect you and your page, and I think that you're bringing up questions that need to be brought up. We didn't get a chance to bring up some of your recent tweets, so I'm just going to very briefly highlight it so people can see some of the things you're talking about now, because I did say that we would cover this, but we got a little bit waylaid.
That's fine.
So your question, you're bringing up some other questions. I recommend people go find your Twitter page or your X page here, Josh 99, Josh G 99, and talking about another topic near and dear to our hearts, whether there was a little bit of a bait and switch on some of the aspects here. But I'm going to close out. People who would like to support the podcast here, they can purchase my book. I don't have a Patreon, but I would like people to read my book. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. This has some echoing in what you're talking about here as far as denominator. When there was a microcephaly epidemic declared in Recife, Brazil in 2015, there had been no prior data registry of microcephaly. There had been no need for one, and so people declared there were more cases of microcephaly in the wards of Recife, which is a metropolitan area of 2.5 million. Ordinarily, based on the data, the stats, the kind of criteria they were using at the time, there should be maybe 7 babies at any given moment with deemed microcephalic, and there were probably about 13 at one moment, and they declared that an epidemic. That in itself is not really statistical validity, but they did it. They announced it as a, and they tied it to this new Zika thing, and they were off to the races. But nobody had ever done the prior registry. It took years. As Mark Twain said, a falsehood will travel the world before the truth can get its pants on. And so eventually, a couple of years later, the truth was getting its pants on, but this time nobody really is able or willing to listen. So we have this problem. Anyway, so people can purchase the book. I would like if they read it, but at the very least they can buy it. It's got a picture of me on the cover. Right, this is me in the morning. Maybe some similarities to my current appearance. Anyway, I'm going to have to call it a day here with us. I'm in your debt. Thank you so much, Josh, for being a wonderful guest, and I hope people follow you and learn from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to say goodbye to everybody here.